October 19th, 1781, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Along a dusty road in Virginia, 8,000 British soldiers marched between two lines of victorious troops stretching nearly a mile. On the left, French regulars in their brilliant white uniforms stood at attention. On the right, American Continentals, many barefoot, their clothes in tatters, watched in silence as their enemy laid down their arms. The band played a melancholic tune. Some say it was the world turned upside down, though no contemporary account confirms this. But symbolically, nothing could be more accurate. The world had indeed turned upside down. The most powerful empire on earth was surrendering to a ragtag army of farmers, merchants, and frontiersmen who had dared to declare their independence just 5 years earlier. This is the story of Yorktown, not just a battle, but a masterpiece of military coordination. A siege that combined European siege warfare techniques with American determination and French naval power. A 21-day operation that trapped 7,000 British troops on a Virginia peninsula and forced a political earthquake that would give birth to a new nation. But Yorktown was not inevitable. It was the result of brilliant strategy, incredible timing, and more than a little luck. It was the culmination of 6 years of desperate fighting, strategic retreats, and gradual learning. And it very nearly didn't happen at all. This is the story of how 3 armies and 2 navies converged on a small tobacco port to decide the fate of an empire. When the first shots rang out at Lexington and Concord in April 1775, few Americans imagined the war would last 6 years. Fewer still believed they could actually win. Britain was the superpower of the 18th century. Its professional army had conquered half the world. Its navy ruled the seas. The 13 colonies had no army, no navy, no manufacturing base for weapons, and no experience fighting conventional European-style warfare. Yet here they were in 1781, still fighting. How had they survived this long? The answer lay not in winning great victories, but in not losing completely. General George Washington understood from the beginning that the Continental Army didn't need to destroy the British Army. It just needed to survive. As long as an American army remained in the field, the Revolution remained alive. As long as Britain had to garrison troops across 3,000 miles of hostile territory, the war would be expensive, unpopular, and ultimately unsustainable. The early years tested this strategy to its limits. Washington's army had been chased out of New York in 1776, suffered through the frozen horror of Valley Forge in 1777, and watched helplessly as the British occupied Philadelphia. But they had also scored crucial victories. Trenton and Princeton in the winter of 76 to 77 showed the world that Americans could fight. And Saratoga in October 1777 changed everything. Saratoga was the turning point not because of its tactical brilliance, but because of its diplomatic consequences. When General John Burgoyne surrendered 5,800 British troops in upstate New York, it proved to skeptical European powers that Americans could actually win battles. France, Britain's ancient enemy, had been watching the revolution with interest. After Saratoga, France moved from covert support to open alliance. The Treaty of Alliance, signed in February 1778, transformed the war. Suddenly Britain wasn't just fighting rebellious colonists, it was fighting France and soon Spain and the Netherlands as well. The American Revolution became a global conflict. British resources were stretched from the Caribbean to India. Most importantly for our story, the French Navy could now challenge British control of the American coast. But the alliance didn't bring immediate victory. In 1778 and 79, the war in the North settled into a stalemate. Washington's army watched the British from a distance. Neither side could strike a decisive blow. The British controlled New York City and its harbor, but couldn't venture far into the countryside without facing ambush and harassment. Washington lacked the strength to assault the city's formidable defenses. So the British changed strategy. If they couldn't crush the rebellion in the north, perhaps they could strangle it in the south. The southern strategy seemed brilliant on paper. The southern colonies, particularly the Carolinas and Georgia, had large loyalist populations. British commanders believed these loyalists would rally to the crown once British regulars appeared to protect them. The South was also economically vital, producing tobacco, rice, and indigo for export. If Britain could secure the southern colonies, they could rebuild their empire from the bottom up, gradually re-establishing control while choking off American trade. The campaign began with stunning success. In May 1780, General Henry Clinton besieged Charleston, South Carolina, after a 6-week siege. American General Benjamin Lincoln surrendered 5,500 men, the largest American capitulation of the entire war. Clinton returned to New York, leaving his subordinate, Lord Charles Cornwallis, to complete the conquest of the South. Cornwallis was one of Britain's most experienced officers. He had fought at the Battle of Minden during the 7 Years' War and had been in America since '76. Personally, he opposed the government's policy toward America, believing the colonists had legitimate grievances. But he was a professional soldier, and he would do his duty. August brought another disaster for the Americans at Camden. General Horatio Gates, the hero of Saratoga, led an army south to challenge Cornwallis. The battle was a catastrophe. Gates's militia broke and ran at the first British bayonet charge. By the time the smoke cleared, 900 Americans were dead or wounded, and 1,000 more captured. Gates himself rode nearly 200 miles in 4 days to escape, his reputation in ruins. By late 1780, British forces held every major port in the South. The strategic position looked hopeless for the Americans, but Cornwallis was about to discover that conquering territory and holding it were two very different things. The problem was guerrilla warfare. Leaders like Francis Marion, Thomas Sumter, and Andrew Pickens waged a vicious partisan war against British supply lines and loyalist militias. Cornwallis could march his army wherever he wanted, but the moment he moved on, American partisans would emerge to terrorize loyalist supporters and ambush British supply columns. The southern colonies weren't being pacified. They were becoming more hostile. Washington recognized the crisis and made a crucial decision. He sent his most talented subordinate south. Nathaniel Greene, a former Quaker from Rhode Island, took command of the Southern Army in December 1780. Greene would never command more than 2,000 regulars, but he understood irregular warfare instinctively. His strategy was simple: avoid major battles, preserve his army, and exhaust the British through constant movement and harassment. The early months of 1781 brought a series of engagements that changed the strategic calculus. At Cowpens in January, General Daniel Morgan's brilliant double envelopment destroyed a British force under Banastre Tarleton. Cornwallis, furious at this humiliation, chased Greene's army across North Carolina in what became known as the Race to the Dan. Greene escaped across the Dan River into Virginia, leaving Cornwallis exhausted and far from his supply base. In March, Greene turned and offered battle at Guilford Courthouse. The fighting was brutal. British regulars advanced through withering fire to drive the Americans from the field. Technically, Cornwallis won, but he lost over 500 men, nearly a quarter of his army, while Greene's forces withdrew in good order to fight another day. It was, as one British member of Parliament later remarked, another such victory would ruin the British army. This was Cornwallis's dilemma. He held the battlefield, but his army was bleeding to death. His supply lines were overextended. The Carolinas remained hostile. He couldn't retreat without admitting failure, and he couldn't advance without risking destruction. So he made a fateful decision. He would march north into Virginia. Virginia was the largest, wealthiest, and most populous colony. If Cornwallis could establish a base there, he could threaten the American breadbasket and potentially march north to link up with Clinton's forces in New York. It was an aggressive, even desperate move, but staying in the Carolinas promised only a slow death. Cornwallis arrived in Virginia in May 1781 with roughly 7,000 troops. His orders from General Clinton in New York were vague and sometimes contradictory. Clinton wanted Cornwallis to establish a naval base on the Chesapeake Bay, but also to send reinforcements to New York. Cornwallis tried to do both, marching his army across Virginia, chasing a smaller American force, under the young French volunteer, the Marquis de Lafayette. By August, Cornwallis had settled on a small tobacco port called Yorktown. The town sat on a peninsula formed by the York River and the James River, emptying into Chesapeake Bay. Clinton had ordered him to establish a fortified position where the Royal Navy could safely harbor. Yorktown seemed ideal. It had a deep water harbor and could be defended from land attack. Across the York River, about a mile away, sat a small village called Gloucester Point, which Cornwallis also fortified to control both banks. What Cornwallis didn't know was that 200 miles to the north, George Washington was planning the most ambitious operation of the entire war. And the key to his plan was sitting in the West Indies, preparing to sail north with the most powerful fleet France had ever sent to American waters. By the spring of 1781, George Washington was frustrated. 6 years of war had brought him no closer to victory. The British still held New York, the largest city in America and the key to controlling the Hudson River. Washington's army had spent the winter camped north of the city, watching and waiting. French reinforcements under General Rochambeau had arrived in Rhode Island in July 1780. But so far, the Allied armies had achieved nothing together. Washington wanted desperately to attack New York. The city was a symbol of British power, and its capture would be a tremendous psychological blow. But New York was also incredibly well defended. The British had spent years fortifying the city and its harbor. Any assault would be costly, and without naval superiority to cut off British supply and reinforcement by sea, probably doomed to failure. In May 1781, Washington and Rochambeau met at Wethersfield, Connecticut to plan the summer campaign. The meeting was crucial. Both men were seasoned commanders, but they came from different military traditions and had different strategic priorities. Washington laid out his preferred plan: concentrate all available forces, perhaps 14,000 men, and assault New York. The city's garrison was smaller than usual since Clinton had sent reinforcements to Cornwallis. There might never be a better opportunity. Rochambeau listened politely but was skeptical. He had fought siege warfare in Europe and knew the difficulties of assaulting a well-defended city without overwhelming force. More importantly, he knew something Washington didn't yet know. Admiral de Grasse was sailing north from the Caribbean with a powerful fleet. If that fleet came to American waters, it could change everything. The conference ended with a compromise. They would prepare to attack New York, but if de Grasse's fleet sailed to the Chesapeake instead of New York, they would pivot and strike at Cornwallis in Virginia instead. It was a contingency plan, nothing more. Washington still believed New York was the real prize. Through June and July, the Allied armies concentrated near New York and began reconnaissance of the city's defenses. Washington even launched a small probe against the northern defenses to test British reactions. To all appearances, a major assault was coming. Then, on August 14th, a courier arrived from the Caribbean with news that changed everything. Admiral de Grasse was sailing north with 28 ships of the line and 3,000 troops. But he wasn't sailing to New York, he was sailing to Chesapeake Bay. And he could only stay until mid-October before returning to the Caribbean for the hurricane season. Washington had to make a choice: abandon his dream of recapturing New York and march 450 miles south to Virginia on the hope that de Grasse's fleet would arrive in time and that Cornwallis would still be at Yorktown when they got there, or proceed with the New York plan and miss the opportunity de Grasse was offering. He chose Virginia. It was one of the most important decisions of his military career. The logistical challenges were immense. Washington had to move 16,000 men, French and American, from the Hudson Valley to Virginia without the British discovering his true intentions. If Clinton in New York realized the Allied armies were marching south, he could either attack their rear or send reinforcements to Cornwallis by sea. Washington launched an elaborate deception campaign. He ordered the construction of large baking ovens near his camp, suggesting preparations for a long siege. He spread false intelligence reports about an impending attack on New York. He sent cavalry patrols towards Staten Island. He even began building boats on the New Jersey side of the Hudson. as if preparing an amphibious assault. On August 19th, the armies began marching south. The French army of 4,500 men was professional, well-equipped, and superbly disciplined. The American Continentals, about 2,000 effectives, were veterans but ragged. Many lacked shoes. Some carried muskets held together with wire and cord. But they were tough, experienced soldiers who had survived 6 years of war. And they were marching toward what might be the decisive campaign. The deception worked brilliantly. Clinton didn't realize the Allied armies had left the New York area until they were well across New Jersey. Even then, he believed they might be heading to attack the British base at Sandy Hook. Only when the armies crossed the Delaware River into Pennsylvania did Clinton finally understand. By then it was too late. The Allies had a week's head start. The march was grueling. Late August in the mid-Atlantic is brutally hot and humid. Men collapsed from heat exhaustion. Supplies ran short. But Washington drove them forward. Every day counted. If Cornwallis learned of their approach and evacuated Yorktown by sea, the entire campaign would fail. If de Grasse's fleet was intercepted by the Royal Navy, the trap would never close. Everything depended on timing and coordination between forces separated by hundreds of miles. On September 6th, Washington reached Chester, Pennsylvania, where the Delaware River meets the Chesapeake. He received news that made him, in the words of an observer, act like a child whose every wish had been granted. De Grasse had arrived. The French fleet was anchored in Chesapeake Bay. 3,000 French Marines had already landed at Jamestown, Virginia. The first part of the trap had been set. But Washington's elation was premature, because at that very moment, a British fleet was sailing south from New York, intent on driving de Grasse away and rescuing Cornwallis. The next few days would see a naval battle that, though not particularly bloody, would prove to be one of the most strategically important in history. To understand what happened in early September 1781, you need to understand the strategic situation at sea. For most of the war, the Royal Navy had dominated American waters. British ships could move troops and supplies up and down the coast with relative impunity. This mobility gave British forces an enormous advantage. They could concentrate against weak points and evacuate threatened positions before being trapped. The French fleet changed this equation, but only temporarily. Naval forces in the Age of Sail were constrained by weather, seasons, and the need to refit and resupply. Admiral de Grasse couldn't stay in American waters indefinitely. He had commitments in the Caribbean, where French and British islands were also at war. His orders allowed him to remain on the American coast only until mid-October. After that, he had to return south. This created a narrow window of opportunity. If the French fleet could keep the British Navy away from Chesapeake Bay for just 6 weeks, Washington and Rochambeau could besiege and capture Cornwallis's army. But if the British fleet could fight its way into the Chesapeake and control the bay, they could resupply Cornwallis indefinitely and potentially evacuate his army. Admiral François-Paul de Grasse was one of France's most experienced naval commanders. Tall, imposing, and aggressive, he had spent decades fighting the British. He sailed from the Caribbean island of Saint-Domingue, modern Haiti, in early August with 28 ships of the line, the largest French fleet ever sent to North America. The flagship was the massive Ville de Paris, mounting 104 guns, the most powerful warship in the Atlantic. When de Grasse arrived at the entrance to Chesapeake Bay on August 30th, he found the entrance undefended. The bay was a vast estuary, nearly 200 miles long and up to 30 miles wide. The York River, where Cornwallis was fortifying Yorktown, fed into the bay from the west. De Grasse anchored his fleet inside the bay and sent transports up the James River to land 3,000 Marines near Williamsburg. From de Grasse's perspective, the situation looked favorable. He had arrived first. His fleet was inside the bay, in a defensive position. Any British fleet would have to fight its way in against unfavorable winds and tides, and his presence meant Cornwallis could not escape by sea. But de Grasse also knew that British Admiral Thomas Graves commanded a fleet in New York. Graves would certainly come south when he learned of the French arrival. The question was when, and with how many ships? Admiral Thomas Graves was in a difficult position. He commanded the North American station of the Royal Navy, but most of his ships were scattered along the coast or escorting convoys. When he learned in late August that de Grasse's fleet had sailed north, he began gathering every available ship. By early September, he had assembled 19 ships of the line. 19 against 28 seemed like poor odds, but Graves had no choice. Cornwallis was trapped in Yorktown. If the French fleet remained in control of Chesapeake Bay, Cornwallis's army would be besieged and eventually forced to surrender. The political consequences of losing 8,000 troops would be catastrophic. The North Ministry in London might fall. The war effort might collapse entirely. On August 31st, Graves's fleet sailed south from New York. The ships were in reasonable condition, though some needed repair. The crews were experienced but undermanned, as were most Royal Navy ships after 6 years of global war. The flagship was HMS London, mounting 98 guns. Graves's plan was simple: sail to Chesapeake Bay, engage de Grasse's fleet, and drive them out of the bay, or at least fight past them to reach Cornwallis. If he could land reinforcements and supplies, Cornwallis could hold out indefinitely. If he could evacuate the army, that would be an acceptable outcome as well. The British fleet made good time south, arriving off Cape Henry at the entrance to Chesapeake Bay on the morning of September 5th. What Graves saw when he looked into the bay must have filled him with dread. De Grasse's fleet was anchored in a long line inside the bay. Even from a distance, their size was apparent. The French ships were larger on average than the British ships, with heavier armament, and there were simply more of them. Graves counted 24 ships of the line at anchor. 4 more were upriver escorting transports. The French outnumbered him significantly. Graves faced a decision. He could try to sail into the bay and fight at anchor, where the French would have every advantage. Or he could wait outside and try to lure the French out to open water, where British seamanship might compensate for inferior numbers. Before he could decide, the French made the decision for him. From the deck of the Ville de Paris, de Grasse saw the British ships appear on the horizon around 8 in the morning. He immediately recognized the danger. If the British fleet entered the bay while his own ships were at anchor, they could potentially destroy his transports and cut off the forces he had already landed. Even if his battle fleet was intact, losing the transports would cripple the campaign. De Grasse made a bold, some would say reckless decision. He would take his fleet out of the bay and fight in open water. This violated standard defensive doctrine. He had every advantage anchored inside the bay. The British would have to come to him, fighting against wind and tide. But de Grasse was an aggressive commander, and he wanted to fight on his own terms, not wait to be attacked. There was only one problem. Getting 24 ships of the line out of Chesapeake Bay was extraordinarily difficult. The entrance to the bay is narrow, with dangerous shoals on both sides. The tides are tricky, and the winds in early September are variable. Ships would have to exit essentially one at a time, which meant the fleet would be disorganized and vulnerable for hours. At 11 in the morning, the signal flags went up. The French fleet would weigh anchor and head for the open sea. It would take nearly 4 hours for all the ships to clear the bay. From the British perspective, this was an opportunity. If Graves had been more aggressive, he might have attacked while the French fleet was strung out and disorganized. But Graves was a cautious commander, perhaps overly so. He held his fleet in formation and waited for the French to emerge, assuming he would have the advantage once they were all out in open water. By 2 in the afternoon, most of the French fleet had cleared the bay and was forming into line of battle. A line of battle was the standard naval formation of the age. Ships would form a single long line, each following the one ahead. This allowed each ship to fire its broadside guns at the enemy line while presenting a relatively small target from ahead or astern. The problem was that forming a proper line took time, especially when ships had just emerged piecemeal from an anchorage. The French line was ragged, with gaps between ships. De Grasse's van, or leading division, was ahead of the center and rear. This should have been another opportunity for the British, but once again, Graves hesitated. At 3:30 in the afternoon, Graves finally gave the order to engage. His plan was to bring his entire fleet parallel to the French line, then turn and fire broadsides into the French ships. It was textbook naval tactics for the age. But execution went wrong almost immediately. Graves issued a confusing series of signals. First, he ordered his ships to form line of battle. Then he ordered them to bear down on the enemy. Then he ordered them to engage the enemy more closely. Different captains interpreted these signals in different ways, especially since some signals contradicted others. The result was chaos in the British line. The Van Division, leading the British fleet, interpreted the orders as a command to engage immediately. Under Commodore Francis Drake in HMS Princessa, the Van turned toward the French van and opened fire. The range was long, around 300 yards, but the French returned fire with devastating effect. But the British center and rear divisions, under Graves himself and Rear Admiral Samuel Hood respectively, did not fully engage. They remained at longer range, firing sporadically. This meant the British van, 8 ships, was fighting alone against 8 French ships, while the remaining 16 ships of both fleets were barely engaged. For the next 2 hours, the van divisions pounded each other at close range. Naval gunnery in the age of sail was brutal. Heavy iron balls smashed through wooden hulls, sending splinters flying through the gun decks. Sailors worked the guns in an inferno of smoke and noise, loading and firing as fast as possible, while enemy shot tore through rigging and men alike. HMS Shrewsbury, HMS Intrepid, and HMS Terrible suffered heavy damage. The Terrible, already in poor condition before the battle, was nearly shattered. French ships also took damage. The August and the Diadem had their rigging badly cut up, but the French ships were newer and sturdier on average, and French gunnery was excellent. By 6 in the evening, the light was fading and the winds were dropping. Both fleets broke off the action. The battle had lasted about 2.5 hours of actual fighting, though the fleets had been maneuvering for nearly 6 hours before that. What happened next was, in some ways, more important than the actual battle. For the next 5 days, the two fleets remained in sight of each other, maneuvering for advantage but not engaging. This was the reality of naval warfare in the age of sail, unlike modern naval battles, which can be over in hours or minutes. 18th century fleet actions could last days. Ships were slow, dependent on wind and weather. Once battle lines were formed, it was difficult to break them up and reform. Admirals were cautious about engaging unless conditions clearly favored them. Graves hoped to find an opportunity to attack the French on favorable terms, perhaps catching part of their fleet separated, or forcing a melee where British seamanship might tell. De Grasse simply needed to prevent the British from getting past him into Chesapeake Bay. As long as he remained between Graves and the bay entrance, he was accomplishing his mission. On September 9th, Graves made a crucial realization. He couldn't defeat the French fleet, even if he managed a tactical victory. His ships were too damaged to force their way into the bay and support Cornwallis. Moreover, he had just learned that another French squadron, 8 ships under Admiral Barras sailing from Newport, Rhode Island, had entered Chesapeake Bay while the British fleet was engaged with de Grasse. The French now had 36 ships in the Chesapeake against Graves's 19. And 5 of those 19 were badly damaged. The HMS Terrible was taking on water so badly she would have to be scuttled a few days later. The strategic balance had shifted decisively. On September 10th, Graves ordered his fleet to return to New York. He would refit his damaged ships, gather reinforcements, and try again. But everyone knew it would take weeks. By the time the British fleet could return to the Chesapeake, Cornwallis would be on his own. The Battle of the Chesapeake, also called the Battle of the Virginia Capes, was not a dramatic tactical victory. French casualties were about 220 dead and wounded. British casualties were about 350. No ships were sunk during the actual battle, though the Terrible was scuttled afterward. In terms of carnage, it was a relatively minor engagement, but strategically, it was one of the most important naval battles in history. By driving the British fleet away and maintaining control of Chesapeake Bay, de Grasse made the siege of Yorktown possible. Cornwallis was now completely isolated. He could not be reinforced, he could not be supplied, and he could not escape by sea. The French Navy had accomplished what the Continental Army could never have done alone: neutralize British naval superiority in a crucial theater at a crucial moment. The Battle of the Chesapeake is a textbook example of how naval power, even without decisive tactical victory, can determine the outcome of campaigns on land. For Cornwallis in Yorktown, the implications were ominous. He had been confident that the Royal Navy would maintain control of the sea and keep his lines of communication open. Now he was trapped on a Virginia peninsula with an enemy army approaching from the north. He had no choice but to dig in and hope relief arrived before he was overwhelmed. But relief was not coming, and marching south toward him were 19,000 French and American troops under two of the most capable commanders of the age, preparing to demonstrate the art of siege warfare in its most lethal form. By the end of September 1781, the pieces were moving into place for the final act. French and American troops were converging on Yorktown from multiple directions. Admiral de Grasse's fleet sat astride the Chesapeake, an impenetrable barrier between Cornwallis and rescue. Inside the small tobacco port, 7,500 British, German, and Loyalist troops prepared for a siege they all knew was coming. George Washington reached Williamsburg, Virginia, on September 14th. The town was about 13 miles from Yorktown, close enough to coordinate the final movements, but far enough to be out of cannon range. Washington had not been in his home state of Virginia since leaving to take command of the Continental Army 6 years earlier. Now he was returning to fight the climactic battle of the war on his native soil. The reunion of forces at Williamsburg must have been a remarkable sight. The Marquis de Lafayette was already there with his force of 3,200 Continentals. Lafayette, just 23 years old, had been chasing Cornwallis across Virginia all summer, staying close enough to observe, but never strong enough to risk battle. Now his former commander had arrived with an overwhelming force. General Rochambeau's French regulars arrived from the north, 4,500 professional soldiers who had marched 450 miles without significant straggling. Their white uniforms and precise formations impressed the American troops, many of whom had never seen a European army in full panoply. Admiral de Grasse sent 3,000 Marines and sailors ashore from his fleet. These men would serve as infantry during the siege, manning trenches and siege lines. The French Marines were crack troops, trained for both naval and land combat. When all the contingents were assembled, Washington commanded approximately 19,000 men. Of these, 8,800 were American Continentals and militia, 7,800 were French regulars, and the remainder were French Marines and sailors. It was the largest concentration of military force in North America during the entire Revolutionary War. Facing this overwhelming host, Cornwallis had roughly 7,500 effectives. About half were British regulars, veteran troops who had fought across the American South. About 1,600 were Hessian mercenaries, German soldiers in British service. The remainder were American loyalists, colonial supporters of the Crown, who had staked their futures on British victory. There were also about 800 sailors from ships trapped in the harbor. The disparity in numbers was severe, but Cornwallis still had advantages. Yorktown itself was fortified. The British had spent weeks building earthworks, redoubts, and artillery positions. The town sat on a bluff overlooking the York River, with clear fields of fire on the landward approaches. Across the river at Gloucester Point, another 1,000 troops held a fortified position that controlled the northern bank, and the Royal Navy might still break through the French blockade. On September 28th, the Allied armies marched from Williamsburg toward Yorktown. The French took the left flank, approaching from the southwest. The Americans took the right, approaching from the northwest. As they drew near, reconnaissance patrols reported something unexpected. The British had abandoned their outer line of defenses. On the night of September 29th, under cover of darkness, Cornwallis ordered his troops to evacuate the outer ring of fortifications surrounding Yorktown. They pulled back to an inner defensive perimeter. Closer to the town itself, The outer works, which had taken weeks to build, were left empty. This decision has been debated by military historians ever since. Why give up prepared defenses and shorten your defensive perimeter when you're already outnumbered nearly 3-1? Cornwallis's reasoning was based on his assessment of the situation. His outer defenses covered too much ground to be held by his limited forces. If the Allies attacked multiple points simultaneously, his defenders would be spread too thin to hold everywhere. By contracting to an inner ring, he could concentrate his forces and create a stronger, more defensible position. Moreover, Cornwallis still believed relief was coming. General Clinton in New York had promised to sail south with reinforcements by October 5th. If Cornwallis could hold out for a week or two, a British fleet would arrive to break the siege. All he needed to do was survive until then. But the decision had immediate consequences. When Allied patrols entered the abandoned British works on September 30th, they found intact fortifications, clear fields of fire, and excellent positions for artillery. Instead of having to assault these works under fire, the Allies could occupy them and use them as starting points for their own siege operations. Washington and Rochambeau immediately ordered their engineers forward to begin planning the siege lines. What followed would be a textbook example of 18th century siege warfare, the kind of methodical scientific reduction of a fortress that European armies had been practicing for centuries. To understand what happened at Yorktown over the next 3 weeks, you need to understand the principles of siege warfare as practiced in the 18th century. These techniques had been perfected by French military engineer Sébastien Le Prestre de Vauban in the late 17th century and were still standard practice 80 years later. The basic concept was to approach a fortified position through a series of parallel trenches, each one closer to the enemy defenses than the last. These parallels would be connected by zigzag approach trenches that provided covered routes for troops and supplies while offering no straight lines for enemy artillery to fire down. From each parallel, siege guns would bombard the enemy fortifications, gradually reducing them to rubble. When the parallels got close enough, usually around 200 to 300 yards, the besieging force would launch an assault on the most vulnerable points. Once these were taken, the defenders would usually surrender rather than face the massacre that typically followed a successful assault. Siege warfare was slow, methodical, and expensive in ammunition. But if executed properly, it was nearly irresistible. The defender's only real hope was relief from the outside, or the besieger running out of time or supplies. Cornwallis hoped for the former. Washington was determined not to allow the latter. The Allies had advantages beyond mere numbers. The French army brought extensive experience in European siege warfare. French engineers, particularly Colonel Querinet de la Combe and Colonel Desandrouins, were experts in their field. They had conducted sieges before and knew exactly how to organize the work. The French also brought heavy artillery. Rochambeau's army train included dozens of large siege guns, mortar, and howitzers. De Grasse's ships contributed additional heavy naval cannon brought ashore. When combined with American artillery, the Allies would have over 100 heavy guns, far more than Cornwallis could match. The American troops, while less experienced in formal siege warfare, were excellent diggers and builders. Many were farmers accustomed to hard physical labor. They could move earth faster than European soldiers, a crucial skill when digging miles of trenches. On October 6th, everything was ready. The first parallel would be dug that night. The location chosen for the first parallel was roughly 600 yards from the British inner defenses. This was beyond effective range of British musket fire, but within range of siege artillery. The line would stretch over 2,000 yards from the York River on the north, curving around the British positions to a deep ravine on the south. On the night of October 6th, 1,500 men moved forward carrying picks, shovels, axes, and fascines. Fascines were bundles of sticks tied together, used to reinforce earthworks and provide instant cover. Another 2,800 troops deployed as covering force in case the British tried to interrupt the work. The operation proceeded in near total silence. Sentries posted listening posts to detect any British patrols. Troops removed their equipment to eliminate noise. Officers moved up and down the line in soft shoes, whispering orders. The goal was to dig as much as possible before the British realized what was happening. The work was backbreaking. Men dug frantically, throwing dirt forward to create a parapet, while excavating a trench deep enough to provide protection. 600 yards was a long line to dig in a single night, but the troops were motivated. They knew that when dawn came, British artillery would target any incomplete sections. By dawn on October 7th, the first parallel was complete. It wasn't perfect. Some sections were shallower than others. The parapet wasn't as thick as it would eventually become, but it was continuous, and it provided cover. When British observers saw the new trench line that morning, they were shocked. An entire fortified line had appeared overnight, just outside cannon range. The British opened fire immediately, but with little effect, at 600 yards. Even heavy guns lacked accuracy. Most shots fell short or sailed over the trenches. A few unlucky soldiers were killed by direct hits, but overall the trench held. Over the next 2 days, troops worked to improve the first parallel. The trenches were deepened, the parapets thickened with more earth, and gun emplacements were prepared. Meanwhile, heavy siege guns were dragged forward from the rear through the approach trenches. Moving cannon weighing several tons through soft earth was grueling work requiring hundreds of men. By October 9th, everything was ready for the grand opening of the Allied bombardment. October 9th, 1781, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. George Washington stood beside a massive 24-pounder siege gun in the first parallel. French and American officers surrounded him, along with several hundred soldiers who had gathered to watch. This was a ceremonial moment, and everyone knew it. The gun was loaded and aimed at the British defenses. Washington took the firing lanyard in his hand. For a moment, the battlefield was silent except for the distant sounds from the British lines. Then Washington pulled the lanyard. The gun roared. The heavy iron ball arced across the 600 yards, separating the lines, and crashed into a British fortification. Legend says it struck a house where British officers were dining, killing several. Whether this is true or not, the symbolism was perfect. Washington, who had spent 6 years retreating and avoiding battle, was now on the offensive with overwhelming force. Following Washington's shot, the bombardment began in earnest. All along the first parallel, cannons opened fire, American guns on the right, French guns on the left, more than 40 heavy cannon firing as fast as their crews could load them. The noise was overwhelming, a continuous thunder that could be heard miles away. The targets were British fortifications, artillery positions, and the ships anchored in the harbor. The Allied gunners were skilled, and the range was relatively short. Shot after shot slammed into earthworks, collapsing parapets and dismounting guns. Heated shot, iron balls made red-hot in furnaces before firing, were aimed at the ships. These incendiary rounds were designed to set wooden vessels ablaze. The effect was devastating. British defenders huddled in their positions as cannonballs crashed around them. Return fire was largely ineffective. The British had fewer guns, many of which were damaged or dismounted by Allied fire. British gunners who tried to serve their pieces were targeted by sharpshooters in the Allied trenches. On the night of October 10th, one of the British ships, HMS Karen, a 44-gun frigate, was struck by heated shot and caught fire. The flames spread quickly through the rigging and decks. Efforts to save the ship failed, and she burned to the waterline, a pillar of flame visible for miles. Other ships were scuttled to prevent similar fates, their cannon removed and brought ashore to reinforce the defenses. The bombardment continued day and night. Crews worked in shifts, some guns firing constantly while others were swabbed and reloaded. The noise, smoke, and destruction were incessant. For the British troops inside Yorktown, it was a nightmare. Buildings were demolished, earthworks collapsed, casualties mounted, food and water supplies ran low, and there was no respite. A British officer wrote in his diary, "We could traverse the town in no direction without encountering dead or wounded. The enemy's shells and cannonballs are incessant," another observed. One saw men lying nearly everywhere who were mortally wounded and whose heads, arms, and legs had been shot off. Cornwallis's headquarters was struck multiple times. At one point, the Earl was forced to take shelter in a covered dugout while cannonballs crashed into the building above. His illusions about holding out until relief arrived were crumbling along with his fortifications. By October 11th, Washington and Rochambeau decided the British defenses were sufficiently degraded to begin the second parallel. The second parallel would be dug just 300 yards from the British lines. This was well within range of British muskets and artillery. The work would be dangerous and casualties were expected to be higher, but success would bring Allied guns close enough to pound the British defenses into rubble at point-blank range. There was one problem: 2 British redoubts, small fortified positions, extended forward from the main defensive line directly across the planned route of the second parallel, Redoubt 9, closer to the river, and Redoubt 10, farther inland, were obstacles that couldn't be bypassed. If the second parallel was to reach its full length, these redoubts would have to be taken. On the night of October 11th to 12th, work began on the second parallel, as expected. British fire was more effective at this shorter range. Men were hit by musket balls and canister shot. Grape shot fired from cannon that turned the guns into giant shotguns. But the work continued. By dawn, most of the second parallel was complete, though the section near the 2 redoubts remained unfinished. Over the next 2 days, Allied artillery moved into the new parallel and began firing at even closer range. The effect on the British defenses was catastrophic. Fortifications that had survived bombardment from 600 yards were blown apart at 300. British casualties increased dramatically. Soldiers took shelter wherever they could, often huddling in bomb-proofs, covered dugouts that offered some protection. Cornwallis sent desperate messages to Clinton in New York. Where was the promised relief? When would the fleet arrive? Clinton responded with assurances that a fleet was being prepared and would sail soon. But soon wasn't fast enough. The situation in Yorktown was deteriorating by the hour. On October 14th, Washington and Rochambeau made the decision. The 2 British redoubts would be stormed that night. Redoubt 9 and Redoubt 10 were small forts, really just earthen walls surrounded by ditches and topped with sharpened stakes called abattis. But they were strongly held and would be defended desperately. Capturing them would require nighttime assault with bayonets, brutal close quarters fighting in the dark. 2 assault columns were organized. The Americans would attack Redoubt 10, closer to the river and considered slightly less defended. The French would attack Redoubt 9, farther inland and more heavily fortified. The American column numbered 400 men from 2 light infantry battalions. Command was given to Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Hamilton. This assignment was significant. Hamilton was Washington's former chief of staff, brilliant, ambitious, and frustrated by years spent writing letters and orders while others won glory in combat. He had begged Washington for a field command, and now he had his chance. Hamilton's plan was daring. The assault would be silent until contact was made. No muskets would be fired. The troops would rely on bayonets alone. Speed and surprise would be everything. Pioneers with axes would lead, cutting through the abattis behind them. Infantry would pour through the breach and overwhelm the defenders before they could organize resistance. Supporting Hamilton was Lieutenant Colonel John Laurens, son of Henry Laurens, who would later serve as a peace negotiator in Paris. The attack would be led by forlorn hope units, volunteers who understood they faced the highest casualty rates, but would also receive the most honor if they survived. The French column was commanded by Colonel Guillaume de Dupont, commanding the Royal Dupont Regiment. His force of 400 men faced a tougher task. Redoubt 9 was larger, more heavily defended, and positioned on higher ground, but the French troops were professionals who had trained for exactly this kind of operation. At 8 o'clock in the evening on October 14th, the signal was given. 6 shells fired in rapid succession from the first parallel. The assault columns moved forward in darkness. Hamilton's troops advanced in 2 columns, moving quickly across the open ground between the second parallel and Redoubt 10. British sentries spotted them when they were about halfway across and opened fire. Musket balls zipped through the darkness, but the Americans kept moving. The pioneers reached the abattis and began hacking at the sharpened stakes. The barrier was stronger than expected. Hamilton, impatient, ordered his men to climb over it. Soldiers scrambled over the stakes, dropping into the ditch beyond, then climbed up the earthen wall. The British defenders, about 70 troops under Major Campbell, met them with bayonets and musket fire. For a few minutes, the fighting was savage. Men stabbed and clubbed each other in near total darkness. The Americans outnumbered the defenders and kept coming. More and more troops poured over the parapet. Hamilton led from the front, sword in hand, shouting encouragement. John Lawrence, leading a flanking detachment, broke through on the left side. The British defenders, surrounded and overwhelmed, began surrendering. Some tried to flee toward the main British lines but were cut down or captured. Within 10 minutes, Redoubt 10 was in American hands. Hamilton immediately sent a messenger running back to Washington with a note, "The Redoubt is ours." His casualties were remarkably light, 9 killed, 31 wounded. The British lost about 20 killed and the rest captured. The French assault on Redoubt 9 was harder. The Redoubt was more heavily defended, with about 120 troops under Major McPherson. The French approached in column formation, professional and disciplined even in darkness. When they reached the abattis, they found it stronger than the Americans had faced. Axes rose and fell, but the barrier held. French troops began climbing over the obstacles, exposing themselves to devastating fire from the British defenders. The fighting here lasted nearly 30 minutes, far longer than at Redoubt 10. French discipline held. Wave after wave of white uniformed soldiers climbed the walls. Eventually, sheer numbers told. The British defenders were killed or forced to surrender. French casualties were heavier than American. 15 killed, 77 wounded. But the mission was accomplished. Both redoubts were in Allied hands. Immediately, engineers and work parties moved forward. The captured redoubts needed to be reversed. Their walls torn down on the side facing British lines and rebuilt facing the opposite direction. The positions also needed to be connected to the second parallel. Hundreds of men worked through the night, digging frantically while British artillery targeted them. By dawn on October 15th, both redoubts were integrated into the Allied siege works. The second parallel now extended its full length. Allied artillery moved forward into the captured positions. Guns were now barely 200 yards from the main British lines. For Cornwallis, this was the end. His outer defenses had collapsed. His fortifications were being systematically destroyed. His casualties were mounting unsustainably, and the promised relief from New York still hadn't arrived. He had one last desperate card to play. On the night of October 16th, Cornwallis attempted what military historians would later describe as one of the most desperate escape attempts in military history. His plan was to evacuate his entire army across the York River to Gloucester Point under cover of darkness. Once there, he would break through the French cordon, march overland north toward Maryland and Pennsylvania, and somehow reach New York over 300 miles away. The plan was, to put it mildly, optimistic to the point of fantasy. His troops were exhausted and demoralized. He would have to abandon his artillery and siege guns. He would have to leave behind his sick and wounded. The route to New York would take him through hostile territory where militia would harass him constantly, and he would be pursued by Lafayette's mobile force. The odds of reaching New York were essentially zero. But Cornwallis was out of options. Staying in Yorktown meant certain capture within days. At least an escape attempt offered a chance, however slim. The evacuation began after dark. Boats shuttled back and forth across the river, carrying troops to the Gloucester side. The first wave made it across successfully. About 1,000 troops were on the north bank when nature intervened. A violent storm blew in. Heavy rain and strong winds lashed the river. Boats were scattered, some driven far downstream. The river became too dangerous to cross. The evacuation was suspended, then abandoned. By dawn, the troops who had crossed were ferried back. The escape attempt had failed. Many in the American camp saw this storm as providential, divine intervention to secure American independence. Whether one believes in such things or not, the timing was certainly fortunate for the Allied cause. October 17th dawned with the Allied bombardment reaching its crescendo. Over 100 guns now hammered the British positions. The volume of fire was so intense that British gunners could barely show themselves to return fire. Buildings in Yorktown were reduced to rubble. Cornwallis's command post was hit repeatedly. The situation was hopeless. At 9 in the morning, a British drummer appeared on the parapet. He beat out the call for parley, the signal requesting a ceasefire to negotiate terms. An officer followed, waving a white handkerchief. Slowly, the firing died down along the lines as word spread. After 3 weeks of continuous bombardment, the silence was eerie. The British officer delivered a message from Cornwallis to Washington. It was brief and to the point. "Sir, I propose a cessation of hostilities for 24 hours, and that 2 officers may be appointed by each side to meet at Mr. Moore's house to settle terms for the surrender of the posts at York and Gloucester." The siege of Yorktown was over. The negotiation of surrender terms would begin. The negotiations took place on October 18th at the Moore House, a plantation home roughly halfway between the lines. The Allied commissioners were Colonel John Lawrence for the Americans and Viscount Denai, Rochambeau's son-in-law, for the French. The British sent Colonel Thomas Dundas and Major Alexander Ross. The discussions were professional but tense. The British commissioners hoped for lenient terms. Specifically, they requested the honors of war, meaning their troops could march out with colors flying, drums beating, and carrying loaded muskets, then ground their arms at a place of their choosing before being granted parole. The honors of war were traditional in European warfare, a way of acknowledging that the defeated had fought bravely and earned respect. But Lawrence and Denai were having none of it. Lawrence in particular was adamant. He reminded the British of Charleston, where American General Benjamin Lincoln had been denied the honors of war when forced to surrender in May 1780. The message was clear. You showed no mercy at Charleston, expect none here. After hours of negotiation, the final terms were settled. British and German troops would march out with shouldered arms and colors cased, meaning their flags rolled up and covered. They would march to a designated field and ground their arms there. They would be prisoners of war but would be granted parole, meaning they would not have to perform labor and would eventually be exchanged for American prisoners. Loyalist troops who had fought for the British would not be included in the surrender agreement. Their fate would be decided separately, and many feared harsh treatment from American authorities. This was one of the war's many tragedies, the Civil War dimension that tore communities and families apart. One sticking point remained. British drummers and fifers, if they played an American or French tune during the surrender march, would technically be honoring their captors, another mark of humiliation. Cornwallis wanted them to play a British march. Washington refused. The British would not leave with military honors. The final terms were signed on the morning of October 19th. The formal surrender ceremony would take place that afternoon. 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The weather was clear and cool. Autumn at its finest in Virginia. Along the road from Yorktown to the surrender field, French and American troops lined both sides. Stretching nearly a mile, on the left, French regulars stood in perfect ranks, their white uniforms immaculate, their muskets gleaming. On the right, American Continentals, many in rags, some without shoes, stood at attention with fierce pride. Between these two walls of victorious soldiers, the British Army would march to surrender. Inside Yorktown, the British troops assembled for their final march. Many were drunk. Officers had issued extra rations of rum, either as comfort or to prevent mutiny. Some soldiers openly wept. Others stared ahead with blank expressions. These were professional soldiers who had won battles across America, and now they were surrendering to an enemy they had dismissed as rabble 6 years earlier. The procession began. At its head rode not Lord Cornwallis, but Brigadier General Charles O'Hara. Cornwallis had claimed illness and remained in his quarters. Whether he was genuinely sick or simply couldn't bear the humiliation We'll never know. But his absence was noted. The commander who had led these troops wouldn't even face their defeat. The music that accompanied them has become legendary. Tradition says the bands played "The World Turned Upside Down," a popular tune whose title perfectly captured the moment. Modern historians debate whether this actually happened, as no contemporary account specifically names the tune. But even if apocryphal, it's too perfect not to be true in spirit. The world had indeed turned upside down. As O'Hara rode down the lane between French and American troops, the contrast must have been striking. The French troops, allies who had sailed across an ocean to support a cause that wasn't theirs, stood as proof that this was now a global conflict. The American troops, veterans who had endured years of privation, stood as proof that a people fighting for their freedom could defeat even the world's greatest military power. O'Hara, either genuinely confused about protocol or attempting one final slight, rode toward the French lines and tried to present his sword to Rochambeau, symbolically surrendering to France rather than America. Rochambeau, with perfect grace, gestured toward Washington and said something to the effect of, "We are subordinate to the Americans. General Washington will give you your orders." O'Hara then approached Washington and attempted to offer his sword. Washington refused to accept it, as O'Hara was Cornwallis's deputy and not the commander. Washington directed him to surrender to his own deputy, General Benjamin Lincoln. The symbolism was exquisite. Lincoln had been the American general who surrendered Charleston 18 months earlier. The British had denied him the honors of war and humiliated him. Now he stood as the officer who would accept the British surrender. It was a small act of justice in a war that had seen its share of injustices on both sides. O'Hara dismounted and handed his sword to Lincoln. Lincoln held it for a moment, then returned it. This was traditional. The sword was symbolic, and returning it acknowledged the honor of fellow soldiers. But there was no doubt about who had won and who had lost. The British troops then marched to the surrender field, a large open area where they would ground their arms. The process took hours. Each unit marched forward, stacked their muskets in ordered piles, then marched away as prisoners. Some troops threw down their weapons violently, trying to damage them. Others placed them gently, caring for their arms even in defeat. American and French guards watched carefully to ensure order was maintained. There were no incidents of violence or confrontation. Both sides understood that this was a solemn moment in history, and it should be conducted with dignity. By late afternoon, it was over 7,100 British and German troops had surrendered. 800 sailors were also captured. The haul of military equipment was enormous. Over 200 artillery pieces, thousands of muskets, and vast quantities of ammunition and supplies. As the last British troops marched away into captivity, Washington and his officers began to comprehend what. The fastest rider left Yorktown that evening, carrying Washington's dispatch to Congress in Philadelphia. The ride would take 10 days through Maryland, Delaware, and Pennsylvania. Other messengers spread out carrying the news to state governments and local officials they had accomplished. This wasn't just a tactical victory. This was a strategic triumph that could end the war. On October 22nd, the messenger reached Philadelphia around 3 in the morning. He woke the night watchman, who began spreading the word through the city. Church bells began ringing. People poured into the streets. Within hours, Philadelphia was celebrating. Congress received the official news later that morning. The reading of Washington's dispatch, which began, "Sir, I have the honor to inform Congress that a reduction of the British Army under the command of Lord Cornwallis is most happily effected," was met with cheers and tears. Delegates who had debated and argued for 6 years about how to conduct the war now celebrated its potential end. Across America, the reaction was similar. In Boston, in Charleston, in every town and village, people celebrated. There were bonfires and parades. Taverns offered free drinks. It felt like the war was over. But not everyone celebrated immediately. Washington was more cautious. He knew that Britain still held New York, Charleston, and Savannah. He knew the British Army was still formidable. He had seen enough of war to know that a single victory, even one as complete as Yorktown, didn't guarantee peace. And he was right to be cautious. The war wouldn't officially end for another 2 years. News of Yorktown reached London in late November. The reaction was catastrophic for Lord North's government. When North received the news, witnesses reported that he took it as he would have taken a ball in his breast. He reportedly paced back and forth, repeating, "Oh God, it is all over." Again and again, it is all over. The political situation in Britain had been precarious for years. The war was unpopular with many British citizens who saw it as expensive, brutal, and ultimately pointless. Opposition politicians had been calling for peace negotiations. Yorktown turned political opposition into political crisis. The government's majority in Parliament evaporated. In March 1782, the House of Commons passed a resolution stating that anyone who continued the war in America was an enemy to the country. North resigned. King George III briefly considered abdicating rather than accept peace with America, but ultimately relented. A new government under the Marquis of Rockingham took power with a mandate to negotiate peace. The military implications were also severe. Britain had lost nearly a quarter of its forces in North America in a single day. Replacing those troops would be expensive and difficult. More importantly, the disaster at Yorktown damaged British prestige worldwide. If the mighty British Empire could be defeated by colonial rebels, what did that say about British power? The strategic situation was also unfavorable. Britain was fighting a global war against France, Spain, and the Netherlands while trying to suppress rebellion in America. Resources were stretched thin. The French and Spanish navies were challenging British control of the seas. India was under pressure. The Sugar Islands in the Caribbean were threatened. Yorktown made it clear that the American war was unwinnable at an acceptable cost. Peace negotiations began in Paris in April 1782. The American delegation consisted of Benjamin Franklin, already in France and highly respected there; John Adams, the former delegate who had helped draft the Declaration of Independence; and John Jay, a skilled diplomat and lawyer. Henry Lawrence, John's father, joined them later after being released from British imprisonment. The negotiations were complex, involving not just America and Britain, but also France, Spain, and the Netherlands, all of whom had interests to protect. The American negotiators had explicit instructions from Congress to coordinate with France and accept French guidance. But the Americans, particularly Jay, were suspicious of French motives and conducted separate negotiations with Britain. This turned out to be brilliant diplomacy. By negotiating separately, the Americans could play Britain and France against each other. Britain, eager to separate America from France and potentially create a future ally, offered generous terms. France, concerned about Spanish ambitions in North America, didn't object strenuously to American independence as long as French interests in the Caribbean were protected. The Treaty of Paris, signed on September 3, 1783, granted America essentially everything it sought. Britain recognized American independence. The borders of the new nation stretched from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River. From the Great Lakes to Florida, American fishermen gained access to Newfoundland fishing grounds. Both sides agreed to honor pre-war debts and, theoretically, restore property to loyalists, though this latter provision was largely ignored. The generosity of the British terms reflected both realism and long-term strategic thinking. Britain had lost the war. Better to accept reality gracefully and preserve the possibility of future trade and alliance with America than to insist on punitive terms that would create lasting enmity. It was a calculation that would largely prove correct. Despite the bitterness of the war, Britain and America would become close allies within a few generations. Yorktown didn't create the United States. The Declaration of Independence had done that 5 years earlier, but Yorktown made that creation irreversible. It transformed American independence from a hopeful declaration into an accomplished fact recognized by the world's great powers. The immediate aftermath of the war was chaotic. The Continental Army, unpaid for years, was restive. In March 1783, some officers considered a military coup to force Congress to honor its financial obligations. Washington personally confronted them at Newburgh, New York. In a speech that diffused the crisis and reaffirmed civilian control of the military, it was perhaps his greatest service to the country, proving that the American military would serve the people, not rule them. The Army was disbanded in 1783. Soldiers went home with certificates promising future payment, many of which they sold for pennies on the dollar to speculators. The experience of the war had created a national consciousness that hadn't existed before, but also revealed the weakness of the Articles of Confederation government. The United States was independent, but not yet united. The Constitutional Convention of 1787 created a stronger federal government. The Constitution, ratified in 1788, established the framework that still governs America today. George Washington, the hero of Yorktown, became the first president, setting precedents for peaceful transfer of power and limited terms that would define American democracy. But we should also remember what was not resolved at Yorktown: the contradiction at the heart of the American Revolution, that a nation founded on the principle that all men are created equal nevertheless held millions in slavery, would fester for another 80 years before being resolved in a far bloodier conflict. The question of indigenous peoples' rights and land claims would lead to generations of conflict and tragedy. Yorktown was a beginning, not an end. It was the beginning of American independence. Yes, but also the beginning of questions about what that independence would mean, who would benefit from it, and what kind of nation America would become. One aspect of Yorktown that has often been downplayed in American memory is the crucial French contribution. This is unfortunate and historically inaccurate. Without the French fleet at Chesapeake Bay, the siege could never have been established. Without French heavy artillery, the bombardment would have been far less effective. Without French troops and French financing, the Continental Army might not have survived to 1781 at all. The French commitment to American independence cost France heavily. The war debt contributed to the financial crisis that would lead to the French Revolution in 1789. Many of the French officers who fought at Yorktown, including Lafayette, would play roles in that revolution, applying lessons learned in America to the struggle for liberty in their own country. The alliance between Republican America and monarchist France was always somewhat awkward ideologically, but it was effective militarily. And it's worth noting that French support was not purely cynical. Yes, France wanted to weaken Britain, but French volunteers like Lafayette genuinely believed in the American cause of liberty. The ideals of the American Revolution inspired people around the world, including in France. Yorktown was a Franco-American victory, not just an American one. The French troops who stood at attention as the British surrendered had as much right to celebrate as the Americans. Admiral Grasse, who died in France in 1788, never received the recognition in America he deserved for making Yorktown possible. What can we learn from Yorktown 240 years later? Several lessons stand out. First, the importance of international alliances. America did not win independence alone. French support, both financial and military, was crucial. The alliance worked because both nations had complementary goals and capabilities. This lesson would inform American foreign policy for centuries. Second, the value of patience and strategic vision. Washington spent 6 years avoiding decisive battle, preserving his army, and waiting for the right moment. When that moment came at Yorktown, he seized it brilliantly. Strategic patience is often more important than tactical aggression. Third, the decisive nature of combined operations. Yorktown worked because land and naval forces cooperated perfectly. The siege could not have succeeded without de Grasse's fleet, and the fleet alone could not have captured Cornwallis's army. The integration of different military branches toward a common objective is a timeless principle of warfare. Fourth, the importance of logistics and engineering. The Allies moved 19,000 men hundreds of miles and supplied them for weeks while conducting a siege. The engineering expertise to dig miles of trenches and emplace over 100 heavy guns was extraordinary. Wars are won as much by supply lines and engineering as by tactical brilliance. Finally, Yorktown reminds us that even seemingly invincible powers can be defeated by determined adversaries who refuse to give up. Britain in 1781 was the superpower of the age. The Continental Army was often ragged, unpaid, and outnumbered. Yet the Americans won because they were fighting for something they believed in, on their own land, and they never stopped fighting. October 19, 1781 changed the world. A siege on a Virginia peninsula forced the greatest empire of the age to acknowledge that a collection of colonies had become a nation. The methods were old, European siegecraft practiced by Vauban a century earlier, but the result was revolutionary. The first successful colonial rebellion in modern history. The technical details are fascinating. The parallel trenches, the siege artillery, the nighttime assaults on the redoubts, all demonstrate the art of 18th century warfare at its highest level. The coordination between Washington, Rochambeau, Lafayette, and de Grasse was extraordinary, especially considering the communications technology of the time. But beyond the tactics and strategy, Yorktown matters because of what it represents. It represents the idea that people have the right to govern themselves, that a just cause, pursued with determination and supported by allies, can prevail against overwhelming odds, that ordinary people, farmers and merchants and frontiersmen, can defeat professional armies when they're fighting for their homes and their freedom. The path from Yorktown to the Constitutional Convention to the nation America was neither straight nor simple. There were failures and compromises and injustices along the way. But the journey began in earnest on that October afternoon when British soldiers laid down their arms and marched away as prisoners. George Washington would live to see the nation he helped create, serving 2 terms as president before retiring to Mount Vernon. He died in 1799, universally mourned as the father of his country. Cornwallis would go on to serve as Governor General of India and Commander in Ireland. His career not destroyed by Yorktown, but certainly defined by it. Lafayette would return to France to play a complicated role in the French Revolution, always maintaining his friendship with Washington and his love for America. The soldiers who fought at Yorktown on both sides would go home to their families and farms. Most would live quiet lives. Their role in world-changing events, a story to tell grandchildren. The veterans of the Continental Army would become the first generation of American citizens, their experience of suffering and sacrifice creating bonds that transcended the regional differences that had divided the colonies. And the nation born at Yorktown, imperfect and contradictory, but founded on principles of liberty and self-government, would grow to become a major power on the world stage. The echo of those cannon that bombarded Yorktown in October 1781 still reverberates through American society today. This is the story of Yorktown, not just a battle, but the siege that ended an empire and began a nation. A 21-day operation where everything came together at exactly the right moment, where French naval power, American determination, and brilliant generalship combined to achieve what had seemed impossible 6 years earlier. The lesson of Yorktown is simple but profound. With the right strategy, the right allies, and the refusal to give up, even the impossible can be achieved. If you found this deep dive into the Siege of Yorktown valuable, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. We create in-depth historical documentaries focusing on the military campaigns that shaped nations. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss our upcoming videos on other decisive battles of the American Revolution, including the Battle of Saratoga, the winter at Valley Forge, and the naval war in the Atlantic. Share this video with anyone interested in American history, military strategy, or the art of siege warfare. And let us know in the comments, what aspect of Yorktown surprised you most? What other Revolutionary War battles would you like us to cover? History isn't just about dates and names. It's about understanding how the world we live in came to be. Every nation, every institution, every freedom we enjoy has a history. By studying that history, we better understand our present and can make wiser choices about our future. Thank you for watching, and remember, the story of Yorktown is the story of America itself. From improbable beginnings through tremendous struggle, to ultimate triumph. It's a story worth knowing, worth remembering, and worth sharing. Until next time, keep exploring history.